A solitary mechanic buys a decommissioned railway carriage that everyone considers scrap, restores it despite ridicule, and years later discovers a hidden compartment containing money and documents tied to a decades old disappearance, changing his life and the fate of others. On a cold morning in October of 1974, at a forgotten rail yard auction outside a town that most maps didn't bother to name, a 24-year-old mechanic named Thomas Hale made what everyone present agreed was the most pointless purchase of the day. He paid $120 for a decommissioned railway carriage that hadn't moved under its own weight in over 20 years. The carriage sat at the far end of the yard, pushed aside from the locomotives and usable freight cars like something people preferred not to look at too closely. Its paint had peeled away in long, curling strips, exposing rust that had eaten deep into the metal. The windows were cracked or missing entirely. The wheels were locked in place, fused by time and neglect. Someone had spray painted "scrap" across the side in uneven black letters, as if to save future buyers the trouble of wondering. The auctioneer almost skipped it. "All right, folks, last item. Old rail carriage, decommissioned, sold as is. Been sitting here since the early 50s. Probably good for scrap metal, if that. Do I hear 50? There was silence. A few men shifted their weight, hands in pockets. Someone coughed. A couple of younger workers laughed quietly, already turning away. $50 for history, the auctioneer tried again. Come on, somebody. Nothing. Thomas raised his hand. 50. The auctioneer blinked, surprised. I have 50. Do I hear 60? Silence again. 50 going once. 120, Thomas said, his voice steady, bidding against himself. This time, the laughter wasn't quiet. Sold, the auctioneer said quickly, almost relieved, pointing toward Thomas. To the young man who just bought himself a very large problem. The laughter followed Thomas as he walked to the payment table. He counted out the money slowly, bills worn thin from use, most of what he had saved over the past year. When he turned, receipt in hand, he found a man waiting for him. Victor Leland. Everyone in the region knew Victor. He owned the largest machinery dealership within 100 miles, sold refurbished engines, tractors, and equipment to anyone who could afford them, and to many who couldn't. He was always well-dressed, always confident, and always certain he knew better than anyone else in the room. Thomas Hale, Victor said, stepping into his path. I heard you just paid $120 for that pile of rust. Yes, sir. Victor smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Do you know what $120 could have bought you? Thomas didn't answer. A down payment, Victor continued, gesturing toward the trucks parked nearby, on something that actually works. Something useful, not that. I can fix it. Victor laughed, loud enough that several people turned to look. Fix it? That carriage hasn't moved since Eisenhower was a general. The frame's probably warped, the bearings are shot, the undercarriage is fused solid. You'd spend $1,000 and 5 years of your life just trying to make it roll. I can fix it, Thomas repeated. Victor stepped closer, lowering his voice. Listen, son, you're young. You've got skills, I'll give you that. But this? He tapped the receipt in Thomas's hand. This is not skill. This is stubbornness. And stubbornness without sense is just another word for failure. Thomas looked at him, then past him, toward the rusted carriage at the edge of the yard. My father used to say, Thomas said quietly, that the difference between something useless and something valuable is usually just the person working on it. Victor shook his head. Your father didn't run a business. No, Thomas said. He just kept things running when nobody else could. And with that, he walked past him. To understand what happened next, you have to understand where Thomas Hale came from. He wasn't born into money or opportunity. His father, Daniel Hale, had worked as a rail mechanic for most of his life, maintaining freight cars and locomotives along a shrinking line that saw fewer shipments each year. He wasn't a wealthy man, but he was a capable one. There wasn't a machine he couldn't take apart and put back together, often with fewer tools than most people thought possible. Thomas grew up in that world. Oil-stained floors, the smell of metal and grease, the steady rhythm of problem-solving. By the time he was 15, he could diagnose engine failures by sound alone. By 18, he was doing work that older mechanics trusted him with. Then, in the winter of 1972, Daniel Hale died in an accident at the yard. A coupling failure. A moment of bad timing. Just like that, Thomas was alone. The small workshop his father had owned barely covered its own expenses. There were debts Thomas hadn't known about, bills that didn't stop just because someone had died. He worked constantly, repairing farm equipment, fixing old engines, taking any job that paid, but it was never quite enough. He needed something bigger, something steady, something that belonged to him. Then he heard about the auction. Getting the carriage home was its own kind of trial. It took 2 days, a borrowed flatbed, and the reluctant help of 3 men who agreed mostly out of curiosity. The wheels wouldn't turn. The axles had to be forced loose inch by inch. Chains snapped twice before they found one strong enough to drag the carriage onto the trailer. By the time they got it to Thomas's property, a small patch of land with a collapsing shed that passed for a workshop, the sun was setting, and the men who had helped him were shaking their heads. "You're not fixing that," one of them said. "Nobody could." Thomas didn't argue. He just waited until they left, then walked slowly around the carriage, studying it. Up close, it was worse than it had looked at the auction. The frame was rusted but intact. The interior was stripped. Wooden panels rotted away or eaten through. The undercarriage was a mass of seized components, every joint stiff with decades of neglect. But it wasn't destroyed. It was just abandoned. Thomas ran his hand along the metal side, feeling the roughness under his fingers. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's see what you've got left." The first year was nothing but disassembly. Thomas approached the carriage the way his father had taught him to approach any machine, one piece at a time. He documented everything, sketched diagrams, labeled parts. He worked at night after finishing paid jobs during the day, often pushing himself until his hands shook from exhaustion. The neighbors noticed. Word spread. "That Hale boy bought himself a graveyard," someone said at the local store. "He'll give up before winter," said another. Victor Leland drove past once, slowed his truck just enough to watch Thomas working beneath the carriage, then drove on with a smile that suggested he already knew how the story would end. But Thomas didn't stop. By the end of the first year, he had stripped the carriage down to its essential structure. The frame was still solid. The wheel assemblies could be salvaged with enough effort. The bearings would need to be replaced or rebuilt. The braking system was gone entirely. He made lists. He studied manuals. He ordered parts when he could afford them and fabricated them when he couldn't. Year 2 was reconstruction. Year 3 was refinement. By the spring of 1977, 3 years after he had bought it, the carriage moved. Not far, not fast, but it moved. Thomas had laid a short stretch of track across his property, salvaged from abandoned lines and scrap yards. When the carriage rolled forward for the first time under its own restored mechanics, the sound was uneven, rough, but real. He stood there, watching it, feeling something settle inside him that had been restless for years. It worked. Over the next decade, the carriage became more than a project. It became his workshop. Thomas rebuilt the interior, installing tools, workbenches, storage. He turned it into a mobile repair unit of sorts, capable of being moved short distances along track segments he maintained. Farmers brought him broken equipment. Contractors brought him engines others had given up on. He fixed them. Word spread, not as laughter this time, but as respect. By the early 1980s, Thomas Hale had a reputation. If something couldn't be repaired, people said, he was the one who might still find a way. Victor Leland heard those stories. He didn't laugh anymore. In the autumn of 1986, 12 years after the auction, Thomas began a full structural inspection of the carriage. It had served him well, but time leaves its mark on everything, even things that have already been restored once. That's when he noticed it. A section of the floor near the center of the carriage sounded wrong. Not hollow exactly, just different. Thomas had spent enough time with metal to recognize when something didn't match the rest. He cleared the area, removed the surface panels, and exposed the underlying structure. There was an additional plate, not original, welded in place with a precision that suggested intent, not repair. His pulse slowed, then steadied. Carefully, he began cutting through the weld. It took him nearly an hour to remove the plate without damaging what lay beneath it. Inside, there was a compartment, sealed, protected, waiting. Thomas reached in and pulled out a canvas-wrapped bundle, stiff with age. Then another, smaller, leather-bound. He sat down on the cold metal floor before opening them. Inside the canvas bundle was money, old bills, carefully stacked, preserved. Inside the leather case were documents, letters, and one envelope addressed in handwriting that had faded but not disappeared. Thomas Hale paused for a long moment before opening it. Then he began to read, and everything he thought he knew about that carriage changed. Thomas sat on the cold metal floor of the carriage, the letter resting in his hands, the edges brittle with age. For a long moment, he didn't move. Outside, the wind pushed softly against the rusted shell, producing a low, hollow sound that seemed to echo through the metal frame. Finally, he opened the envelope. The paper inside was yellowed, folded with care. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, the kind that belonged to someone who had taken time with every word. It began simply, "To whoever finds this." Thomas leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, and began to read. "My name is Arthur Bell. If you are reading this, then enough time has passed that whatever I feared has either been forgotten or no longer matters. I worked these rail lines from 1946 until 1958. Maintenance, repairs, whatever they needed done. I knew every bolt on this carriage when it still carried freight across 3 states. Thomas frowned slightly. He had never heard the name. In the spring of 1953, something happened that I have carried with me every day since. Thomas shifted, his eyes moving faster now. There was a shipment scheduled through this line. Official paperwork said it was machine parts. That was a lie. Everyone working the yard knew it. Armed guards, locked manifests, orders that came from offices far above anyone we would ever meet. It was money. Thomas glanced at the bundle beside him. Not just money, government money, being transferred quietly, without records that ordinary men could access. I didn't ask questions. Men like me weren't meant to. But something went wrong. Thomas's grip tightened slightly on the paper. The train never reached its destination. Somewhere along the line, between 2 towns that barely exist anymore, there was an incident. That's the word they used later. An incident. What it really was a robbery. Thomas paused. The air in the carriage felt heavier. He continued reading. The train was stopped. Not by accident, not by failure, by design. The men who did it knew exactly where to force it to halt. There was gunfire. Not much, but enough. Enough that 2 men never stood up again. One of them was someone I knew. Thomas swallowed slowly. When it was over, most of the shipment was gone. Taken, vanished. The report said the rest was recovered. That was another lie. Thomas's eyes flicked toward the canvas bundle again. I was sent to inspect the damaged cars 2 days later. Clean up, repair, prepare them for whatever story they plan to tell the public. That's when I found it. Not in a safe, not in a crate, but hidden, rushed, left behind by men who didn't have time to finish what they started. Money, more than I had ever seen. Enough to change a life. Enough to ruin one. Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees now. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, thinking about what it meant, thinking about the men who had died, thinking about the people who would come looking for it. I didn't take it. Not then. I reported the damage. I did my job. I went home. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. The handwriting grew slightly tighter. 3 days later, I went back. The guards were gone. The reports were filed. The story had been decided. No one was looking anymore. I told myself I was just checking, just making sure it had been handled properly. That was a lie, too. Thomas let out a quiet breath. I took it. Not all of it. just what had been left, what they had missed. I told myself I would return it, that I would find a way to do it without destroying my life. But days turned into weeks, weeks into years, and I never did. Thomas closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again. I hid it here, not because it was safe, but because it was close, because I could see it every day and remember what I had done. I sealed it inside this carriage when it was decommissioned. I told myself it would stay here until I found the courage to make it right. The next lines were written more slowly. I never found that courage. I watched men lose jobs, watched families struggle, watched the world move on while I carried something that didn't belong to me. I tried to justify it, told myself the money would never be missed, that the people it belonged to had already written it off. But that doesn't make it right. Thomas shifted again, the metal creaking under him. If you have found this, then you have done something I never could. You have uncovered what was hidden. The money is yours to decide the fate of. I have no right to tell you what to do with it, but I will tell you this. It will test you, not in the way you think, not in what you can buy, but in what you can live with. Thomas stared at those words. There is something else. There were records, not official ones, copies, names, dates, movements tied to that shipment. I kept them because I was afraid that one day someone would come asking questions I couldn't answer. Those papers are in the case with this letter. If what I believed is true, then what happened was not just a robbery. It was allowed to happen. Thomas felt a chill run through him. Men higher up knew, and they let it happen. I don't know why. I didn't have the courage to find out. Maybe you will. The final lines were unsteady. Or maybe you'll do what I should have done and let it end with you. Either way, don't pretend it's nothing, because it isn't. Arthur Bell. Thomas lowered the letter slowly. For a long time, he didn't move. The carriage, the same one everyone had called worthless, now felt like something else entirely. Not just a machine, a container, a decision. He opened the leather case next. Inside were documents, carefully folded, preserved, handwritten notes, names he didn't recognize, dates from the early 1950s, shipment routes, numbers that matched nothing he had ever seen in ordinary work. This wasn't just stolen money. It was something buried, something forgotten on purpose. Thomas sat there until the light outside faded. The question wasn't whether the carriage had been worth $120. The question was what it had just become worth now, and what it would cost him to know the difference. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat inside the carriage long after darkness settled, the letter folded beside him, the documents spread across the metal floor. A single hanging bulb cast weak yellow light over everything, turning the old paper into something that looked almost alive. Money, documents, a secret that had survived more than 30 years. He picked up one of the bundles again, turning it slowly in his hands. The bills were old but preserved, carefully hidden, intentionally forgotten. Arthur Bell had been right about one thing. It wasn't about what you could buy. It was about what you could live with. For 3 days, Thomas told no one. He worked as usual, took in repairs, fixed engines, answered questions with the same quiet patience he always had. But his mind wasn't in any of it. At night, he returned to the carriage. He read the letter again, then again. He studied the documents more closely this time. Patterns began to appear, names repeated, locations circled, dates aligned with rail schedules from that era. Some of the notes didn't look like records. They looked like observations. Someone had been watching something, tracking it, trying to understand it without being seen doing it. Arthur Bell hadn't just taken money. He had been afraid. On the fourth day, Thomas drove into town. Not to the bank, not to the police. He went to the public records office. The building was quiet, almost empty. The kind of place people forgot existed unless they needed something specific. He asked for old rail transport logs, early 1950s, anything connected to freight incidents. The clerk barely looked at him before pointing him toward a back room. Help yourself, most of it hasn't been touched in years. That was exactly what Thomas expected. He spent 6 hours there. Dusty ledgers, faded reports, official summaries written in careful, neutral language that said very little and implied even less. But he wasn't looking for what was written. He was looking for what wasn't. And slowly, piece by piece, the gaps began to match the documents he had found. There had been an incident, but the details didn't line up. Times were off, locations were generalized, names were missing where names should have been. It had been cleaned, edited, reduced to something manageable. That night, Thomas sat in the carriage again, the documents spread out in front of him. Arthur Bell's words echoed in his mind. It was allowed to happen. Thomas leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "Why?" he said quietly. There was no answer, only the weight of a question that had been sitting unanswered for more than 3 decades. Weeks passed, then months. Thomas didn't chase the answer, not fully. He followed it just enough to understand one thing. Whatever had happened in 1953, the people responsible were either gone or unreachable. The system that had buried it had moved on, changed names, changed faces. There would be no clean ending. No moment where the truth came out and everything made sense, just fragments, and a choice. So Thomas made one. The money stayed where it was, for a while. Then, quietly, he began to move it. Not all at once, not in ways that would draw attention. He didn't spend it on himself, didn't expand his workshop, didn't buy new equipment. Instead, he did something smaller, more deliberate. A farmer whose tractor had failed at the worst possible time found the repair already paid for. A family behind on land payments discovered their balance, adjusted. A mechanic's apprentice received tools he couldn't afford, delivered without explanation. It wasn't charity in the usual sense. There were no names attached, no recognition, just problems, quietly removed. Years passed. The carriage remained, still functioning, still central to everything Thomas did. But now it carried something else, not just a secret, a purpose. In the early 1990s, nearly 20 years after the auction, Thomas returned to the same rail yard. It had changed, less active, more empty space, fewer people who remembered what it used to be. But the auctions still happened. Different auctioneer, different crowd, same dust, same quiet sense that everything there had a story, whether anyone cared to hear it or not. Thomas hadn't come to buy. He had come to sell. The carriage stood at the edge of the lot again, not abandoned this time, restored, maintained. Its rust replaced by clean metal, its structure solid, its movement smooth. People gathered around it, not laughing now, but curious, respectful. The auctioneer stepped forward. "All right, folks," he called out. "We've got something special here. Decommissioned rail carriage, fully restored, working condition, owned and maintained for nearly 20 years by Thomas Hale." A pause. Some of you might remember when he bought it, paid $120 for it right here. A few quiet chuckles, not mocking this time, remembering. "Reserve price is $5,000. Do I hear 5? Hands went up immediately. 5, 6, 7, 8. The numbers climbed quickly. 9, 10, 11. "Do I hear 12? A voice from the back. 12. Thomas turned slightly. Victor Leland, older now, slower, but still standing. The bidding continued. 13, 14, $15,000. "Sold!" the auctioneer called. 15,000 to the gentleman in the back. Applause followed, not loud, but real. As the crowd began to disperse, Victor approached. He stopped a few feet away from Thomas, looking at the carriage being prepared for transport. 15,000, he said. "For something I once said wasn't worth 15. Thomas nodded slightly. "That sounds about right." Victor let out a quiet breath. "I was wrong." "Yes," Thomas said calmly, "you were." There was no bitterness in it, just fact. Victor hesitated, then spoke again. "Did you ever figure out why it was built the way it was? Why it lasted?" Thomas looked at him for a long moment, then smiled just slightly. "That's a long story." Victor nodded. "I figured." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Victor extended his hand. Thomas shook it. As the carriage was loaded and taken away, Thomas felt something settle. Not loss, not regret, something closer to completion. Years later, people would still talk about it. The mechanic who bought scrap and turned it into something valuable. The carriage that refused to die. The quiet ways problem seemed to disappear around certain families at certain times. No one ever connected those things completely, and Thomas never explained them. He kept one thing, the letter, folded, preserved, stored carefully. Sometimes, late at night, he would take it out and read it again. Arthur Bell's words, a man who had made a choice and then lived with it. Thomas would sit there afterward thinking about his father, about the carriage, about the difference between finding something valuable and making it valuable. Because in the end, the money hadn't changed his life. The documents hadn't changed his life. Even the $15,000 hadn't changed his life. What changed his life was the same thing that started it. A decision made in a dusty yard when everyone else saw nothing worth taking. Somewhere in another yard on another day, something just like that carriage was still sitting, rusting, ignored, waiting. And the truth was simple. It always had been. The value was never hidden in the metal. It was in the person willing to see something more and stubborn enough to prove it.